For the latest in strategic affairs, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell icon for updates.
The arrival of a Chinese satellite tracking ship in Hambantota, Sri Lanka's southern port, this week has set off a mini geopolitical storm, with India initially objecting to its arrival, Sri Lanka acceding to India's objections, delaying the arrival of the permission for arrival of the Chinese ship, and then finally the Chinese ship coming and docking there for the next 5 days is what has happened this week. What are the implications of this ship coming there and the kind of decision that Sri Lanka has taken in the light of what has happened over the past 6 months is the subject of this week's Ask Nitin. I'm Nitin Gokhale. And as usual, we will have guests joining us with their comments, their queries, their questions. Moments after I finish my initial remarks about what this development means for the Indian subcontinent and for India and Sri Lanka relations. So let's look at what is happening this week in the Indian subcontinent, especially between India and Sri Lanka. As everybody now knows, the Chinese ship, which the Chinese government calls it a research ship, what India has called a satellite tracking ship or a spy ship, and what Sri Lanka has called is a civilian ship. The Sri Lankan Prime Minister, the President, Ranil Wickremesinghe, both of them have called this as a Chinese civilian ship and not a military ship. In all this confusion, there is one truth, and that is that China has prevailed over Sri Lanka to allow this ship to come and dock in Hambantota, which is actually a port that is under Chinese lease for 99 years, which was given to the Chinese company by the previous government, that is Maithripala Sirisena as the president and Ranil Wickremesinghe as the prime minister, not as president but as prime minister between 2015 and 2019. That government had leased out Hambantota port to a Chinese commercial company. Now, this week, the Chinese ship has come there ostensibly to replenish and refurbish some of its requirements and replenish its supplies, its food and fuel supplies, and of course rest and recuperation for its crew. The ship is of course equipped with a lot of radars and equipment that can track many of the neighboring sites, both in Sri Lanka as well as the southern coast of India, both on the east coast and as well as on the west coast of India, where India has many military as well as important civil installations, including atomic energy sites, atomic energy power plants. There are military bases in southern India. There is, of course, the Southern Naval Command in Kochi, and there is the Visakhapatnam-based Eastern Naval Command. Amidst all the worries and concerns that India has, Sri Lankan government had deferred the visit of the Chinese ship in early August. But subsequently, after high-level consultations between Sri Lankan government and the Chinese government, Sri Lanka has decided to go ahead and give permission to the ship to come and dock in Hambantota. Now, India, after the permission was given, has not reacted very vehemently, except saying that India keeps track and India also conveys its concerns to the neighbours. Beyond that, India has not said anything. If anything, India has actually gone ahead and given a gift of a Dornier surveillance and reconnaissance aircraft to the Sri Lankan Air Force on 15th of August, just 4 or 5 days before or 3 days before the Chinese ship has docked in Hambantota. So India is carrying out business as usual, but there is concern in the security establishment in India that the Sri Lankans haven't acceded to India's request and disallowed the Chinese ship to come in there. What are the implications for the relationship between India and Sri Lanka? Well, the fact is India has helped Sri Lanka financially and in kind over the past 6 months substantially. One conservative estimate puts the total aid and assistance that India has given to Sri Lanka at about 3.8 billion or maybe $4 billion in the past 6 to 8 months since the beginning of the year 2022. Given what Sri Lanka is going through, the economic turmoil and the kind of hardships that people are facing in terms of shortages of fuel, food, medicine, India has been the first responder to Sri Lanka's days of distress and has not held back from giving out all-out help to Sri Lankans, saying that India supports the people of Sri Lanka without getting into a fact that governments have changed. There was the Gotabaya Rajapaksa government earlier, and now we have a Ranil Wickremesinghe government. But the first permission to the Chinese ship was given when there was total chaos in capital Colombo, where the president was forced to hide when the protesters had taken over the streets and the presidential palace. The prime minister was helpless. Ranil Wickremesinghe, incidentally, was the prime minister. And the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Sri Lanka had given permission to the Chinese ship to come and replenish its supplies in Hambantota. When India came to know about it, India had lodged a protest, had expressed its concern to the Sri Lankans, who then deferred the visit of the Chinese ship, asked them to wait until further consultations took place, and then allowed the ship to come in, as I mentioned, in the subsequent decision that was taken by Colombo. Now, India, despite all the close relationship it has with Colombo, is aware of the fact that the Chinese have a deep inroads into, I won't call them deeper, but deep inroads into the Sri Lankan government and Sri Lankan establishment. And of course, the Sri Lankans Sri Lankans owe the Chinese about 10% of its total debt accumulated over the years. Many of the infrastructure projects in Sri Lanka, major infrastructure projects, were executed by the Chinese with loans extended by Chinese commercial banks as well as Chinese government. But ever since this crisis began, late last year, early this year, the Chinese have kept away. Although the initial months they did give some 2.8 billion worth of aid and assistance or long-term loans to the Sri Lankans, they have refrained from expressing any solidarity with the people of Sri Lanka or the government of Sri Lanka during the height of the crisis, when there was turmoil in Sri Lanka, in the capital Colombo. The Chinese kept away. Despite that, the Chinese have now managed to get their ship into Hambantota. And this is what India objects to, that the Sri Lankan government hasn't heeded India's concerns, India's worries, and will continue to ignore India's mild protest, is what the Sri Lankans have done. Now, this has implications for the relationship between India and Sri Lanka. And what are those implications? I think India will be now wary of extending unconditional help to Sri Lanka, which does not help the Sri Lankan people, but they'll have to show some toughness against Sri Lanka. The other thing that India will have to really look at is how do you get back leverage in Colombo? Because the new government under President Ranil Wickremesinghe is not exactly known to be friends of Sri Lanka. Friends of India rather, and India has this balancing act to do with the Chinese. The Chinese, on the other hand, think that they have got a foot in the door again with Ranil Wickremesinghe coming there, who also pleads with the Western powers and with the International Monetary Fund to say that because the Chinese hold a decisive kind of an edge in the multilateral institutions, in the UN and in the World Bank and the IMF, it needs China on its side. So what India needs to do is to also start using its leverage in the IMF amongst the Western nations like the United States and the other donors or the supporters of IMF to make sure that Sri Lanka also accedes to India's demands. And they are reasonable demands. India and the US had in fact expressed concern over the arrival of the Chinese ship in the backyard of India, and yet the Sri Lankans have gone ahead and given the permission to China. So it's going to be a very interesting period ahead. We don't know how the Sri Lankans will now take this call on trying to appease India and the US, who continue or who will continue to be important for Sri Lanka for their restructuring of their debt, getting fresh loans, and getting the country out of the financial mess that it finds itself in. I think there are two aspects finally I want to say that perhaps India erred here in upping the ante on the ship's arrival in Sri Lanka. India should have just quietly protested and told the Sri Lankans that you take the decision in your best interest without going public or without going hammer and tongs against the arrival of the Sri Lankan ship. Because most of the time diplomacy and these decisions have to be taken behind closed doors. Having done it publicly or protested publicly or spoken about it publicly, India now has lost somewhat of a standing in Sri Lanka and amongst its own supporters for not having been able to prevent this Chinese ship from coming. But there is a long-term game that India must play here. It must try and regain influence in Colombo and also make sure that it is balancing itself off against the Chinese inroads into the neighborhood. Now, it is not something new. The Chinese inroads have been there for almost 20 years, but this keeps going up and down. What happened in Maldives in 2018 and what happened in Sri Lanka in 2020 or 2019 is evident that India had got an upper hand. The Chinese have got back their presence in both the countries, especially in Sri Lanka. And Indian foreign policy decision makers, foreign policy establishment, national security establishment will have to now improve its delivery, improve its outreach to Sri Lankans and to the other smaller countries in the neighborhood if it wants to retain its influence and its reach amongst the nations around India in the Indian subcontinent. The Chinese now appear to be on the ascendant because of the permission they got for their ship to come in there. But it doesn't mean that it is the end of the story. Strategic affairs is a continuous game. You win some, you lose some. And I think here India has won temporarily, then has lost it. But there is no reason why India cannot win going ahead. But it must continue to make those efforts is what I feel and what I think is the trick or is the name of the game as far as foreign policy and strategic affairs is concerned. That's all I have to say for the moment. I'm eagerly waiting for our guest to join. And I think we have, for the first time, an Indian, fellow Indian, but settled in Australia, joining us from Melbourne. And let me welcome Karthik from Melbourne, who obviously wants to ask a question. But Karthik, please introduce yourself and ask your question. Then I'll be happy to engage with you on this subject.
Thank you, Nitin, for the opportunity. I'm a career commercial banker in Australia for over 10 years. I guess it is a matter which is being looked at from Australia as well with a big eye. So I guess my question is that Hambantota port, if you look at it at the map, it is nearly in between the sea lanes between Malacca Strait and Java Sea, which is primarily a major sea lane, not only for China, but also for Australia, Indonesia, and Singapore, where many investments take place. So how does, when you say efforts from India, how does India engage in this economic militarization of this port, and how should it engage, especially vis-a-vis Quad, which obviously is not called as a military alliance, but how should India um, push its efforts in this regard? Thank you, Nitin.
Oh, very perceptive question, Karthik. I must say that you've understood the essence of Quad, which is not a military alliance, but it has a military dimension, as we can see now. Even Hambantota, which is not a military port as yet, but there is a move by China to progressively start using Hambantota more often, and that is the worry in the Indian establishment, that today, the Chinese satellite tracking ship has come. Tomorrow, nothing stops the Sri Lankans from giving them permission for a submarine and a nuclear submarine and then a ship to come to Hambantota. And you have rightly pointed out that the port is strategically placed in a sense that it is very close to the sea lines of communication, one of the sea lines of communication, which is also important for other nations, both going westward and going eastward. So in this backdrop, what India needs to do is to make sure that Sri Lanka does not go overboard in allowing the Chinese to completely take over the Hambantota port. It should not allow the Chinese to use it as a military base, despite what the Sri Lankans have been saying. There is all possibility that the Chinese will bring in their military personnel there. I think that needs to be a red line as far as Sri Lanka is concerned, from the Indian side and from the other big players like Australia, Japan and the United States. If that red line is drawn from the Sri Lankans, I think they will realize that they must draw a line somewhere for the Chinese and not allow them full freedom in Hambantota. I think that's the key as far as making that effort. And India will have to lead that effort, being the closest neighbor of Sri Lanka, one of the closest friends of Sri Lanka. India will have to lead that effort on behalf of the Quad, these other three nations, and make sure that the Sri Lankans understand the sensitivities. After all, it's a sovereign nation, but there are ways of making another sovereign nation understand the sensitivities that other nations feel, like India, Australia, Japan, and the United States. I think that's the key as far as the Hambantota port and the current development is concerned. Right, Karthik?
Right. Thank you.
Thank you for joining from Melbourne, Karthik, and I'm sure we will have more occasions going forward to hear from you, and keep engaging. I really am delighted that you could join all the way from Melbourne, and good luck to whatever you do in your own profession. I have another guest from my hometown, Pune, old friend Vinay Chati, who's a strategic affairs analyst as well as a former journalist, now a teacher of journalism in Garware College, and of course many other things, author, teacher, and an observer. So Vinay, go ahead with your question.
Yeah, good afternoon. Thank you. Thanks for inviting me for such a informative session. So my question is basically, uh, at this juncture, we are also engaged with China in different regions. There is Himalayan region, that LAC, along with our LAC. But my question is about Quad, because since Chinese ship docks in Sri Lanka, whether it push Quad nations to synergize their efforts, to counter China, and of course in Indian Ocean region and Indo-Pacific region. What is your take on this? Because they need to synergize their effort to counter the China, because most of the energy trade and commercial trade passes through this particular channel. And at this moment, though China is actively involved in this region, still Indian Navy is dominant from Strait of Hormuz to Strait of Malacca. So, what are the implications of this move, and whether it allows or whether it push Quad nations to counter their efforts against China? Thank you.
Oh, very good question. In fact, Quad is, despite its protestations, despite its constant reassertion that we are not against any nation, Quad is, after all, trying to balance China off in the Indo-Pacific. There is only one subtle difference between how Quad nations see their approach towards China. India says that we will get together in Quad in a non-military alliance or a non-military grouping. India does not want to be a part of any military alliance against China. And therefore, what the Quad nations will do is they'll synergize their efforts on all other aspects, like getting the supply chain, resilient supply chains to these three countries, United States, Japan, and Australia, and India, of course. Also, cooperating on climate change, on technology, on cyber issues, both defensive and offensive, but not get into a military alliance in the amongst the Quad nations is what India's approach is, and which is fair because remember, amongst all the Quad nations, India is the only one, like you mentioned, a country which has a land border dispute with China, and we are engaged in the standoff with China for the past 2 years. So therefore, India has to be very aware of how long and how far it can go as far as Quad is concerned. But yes, Quad can do multiple things in other aspects, on scientific cooperation, technology cooperation, on climate change, as I mentioned, on people-to-people contacts between these nations, and that's exactly what India is driving Quad towards. Although the other three may not sort of completely agree on the India's approach, but that is India's approach because India has a bilateral issue with China too, and a boundary dispute with China, unlike the other three nations in the Quad. I think that's the key as far as dealing with this particular issue is concerned. Right, Vinay?
Yeah, thank you. My another question is, it is about the geostrategic. We are engaged with China geostrategically, but basically, we already have differences with China about our line of actual control, and we are engaged with them along with Himalayan region. Will this move affects Indian interest in Indian Ocean region, or whether China is trying to marginalize India in this particular region? What is your take on this?
So there is this, theory amongst some of the strategic affairs analysts that if we have to ease the pressure in the Himalayas or on the land border, India must become stronger in the Indian Ocean region and in the Indo-Pacific or in the maritime domain. Well, it's not one or the other. I think India has to keep concentrating on both the domains, both the land domain as well as the maritime domain, because China is a far bigger power, both militarily and economically, and it has the resources to engage or keep India off balance in both the land domain as well as the maritime domain. So India has to be very aware of this danger. Although India does have an edge in the maritime domain given its long tradition of naval history and naval practices, as well as the position, the geographical position India is in as far as Indian Ocean is concerned. So therefore, it's a very delicate kind of an approach India has to adopt to keep China at bay and not allow China to gain an upper hand in the maritime domain, and also make sure that the standoff in Ladakh does not go out of hand and develop into a long-term conflict or a long-drawn kinetic conflict. Right now, it's a standoff, and India should make an attempt until it becomes more powerful, more economically developed and economically powerful and militarily stronger to keep this approach of keeping China engaged, but also being resolute on the border, also in the maritime domain. I think that's the key as far as India's bilateral approach to China is concerned.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Vinay. Thank you for joining. Let me go to another guest. We have a lady joining us. Please introduce yourself and ask your question.
Good afternoon. My name is Himali Nalaude. I'm speaking from Pune. I'm a journalist for News Bharati. So my question is that Sri Lanka is located at a very strategic location. So for India, it is very important to keep Sri Lanka under its sphere of influence to dominate the Indian Ocean region, which until quite recently we have been doing quite successfully. But since things are changing in the Indian Ocean region, China's dominance on Sri Lanka is increasing. So, every other country around the world is interested in the region. They have their foreign policies aligned in that direction. But now that everyone needs to work together now, in case of Sri Lanka, it will countering China regarding Sri Lanka. Um, uh, in that matter, will India stands in the Russia-Ukraine war, where India had stayed aloof from the European conflict, will that stand in the way of other world countries? Uh,
A very good question. I think very comprehensive question. I will break it up into two parts when I answer it. One is India's approach to Sri Lanka via the prism of Quad, in the sense that all the Quad countries are very eager and very determined to help Sri Lanka come out of the current mess it finds itself in, current situation it finds itself in. There is no difference of opinion as far as Japan, India, Australia and the United States is concerned. And that is why at least United States and India express concern about the Chinese ship coming into Hambantota at a time when Sri Lanka is going through this difficult times. Nevertheless, India also has a bilateral stake in Sri Lanka, which I have explained right at the beginning of the program. But your question about how will the Western powers, especially Europe and the United States, look at India as a partner in helping Sri Lanka if India is not aligning with them on the stand that they have taken against Russia in the Russia-Ukraine war. Now, that's something India has made very clear, that it puts national interest above principles in this case. Because in this case, India's national interest lies in keeping the channel open to Russia, not just for oil, but also for defense equipment. India is dependent on Russia. India is an old friend of Russia. Russia has helped India in the past, and the Western nations haven't really come to our help in the past 50, 60 years when required at a crunch time. Therefore, India has made that clear to the world capitals like Washington to Tokyo, and also to Canberra, Australia. Now, they have understood this, and therefore diplomacy, as has been mentioned in the past by many other people, it's about the art of possible. You can align different opinions, you can balance different interests, and also make sure that the national interest of a country is protected despite multinational alignments or multi-alignments with different countries. And that's exactly what India is doing. Today, it is friends with the United States. At the same time, it is very close to Russia. It is friendly with Iran, and at the same time, it has good relations with Israel. I think that's the key. That's the difference between our earlier policies of trying to do a kind of foreign policy which would not look at national interest first, but look at how the world looked at India. I think the big difference is that today India makes it clear, India's external affairs minister, India's prime minister always make it clear that India's national interest will gain priority, will always have the priority when it comes to dealing with other nations. And I think that's the approach India has adopted as far as the situation in Sri Lanka and its kind of alignment with the Western nations and the United States is concerned when it comes to the Russia-Ukraine conflict which is currently going on. I hope I have answered your question.
yes, sir.
Thank you very much for joining. Thank you. It was a very perceptive question. So viewers, you saw different questions from three different people who engaged with me on this program. As I said, Ask Nitin is all about more engagement with our viewers, with our subscribers on the YouTube channel. So do keep watching, and not only watching, but also participating in larger numbers. If the numbers are larger, if the questions are perceptive enough or interesting enough, I will in fact extend the duration of the program if need be, whenever required. So do keep watching StratNewsGlobal as well as Ask Nitin every Saturday at 7 p.m. And of course, send us feedback. You know where to reach us. If you're already a subscriber, please spread the word. Tell your friends, family, acquaintances to subscribe to StratNewsGlobal YouTube channel. And of course, our social media handles are very well known to you. Also spread the word about them, follow them, and of course, keep engaging with me whenever required. For the moment, that's all I have. So let me say goodbye. But until we see each other, maybe next Saturday, I have only this much to say in this program. For the time being, it's goodbye.